That one? Good.
22-year-old Whitney Gray is spending time at home with her 2 young kids.
Oh, yeah, there you go. I don't know. You got it.
Whitney could definitely light up a room just with walking in.
And the big one. Do you want that one?
She loved her kids with everything she had. I mean, with everything.
She'd color with them, play blocks with them, lay on the floor, jump on the bed with them. She was a fun mom. She was very fun.
Yes, baby genius, let's go.
Look what I found.
Whitney's 16-year-old niece has come to help prepare for Halloween.
Oh, yes.
My granddaughter really clicked with her.
Whitney was kind of a role model to her. She helped point her in the right direction.
Whitney had a good heart. She had good morals. She was a good person that way.
Halloween is gonna rock this year, yeah?
She loved all holidays, whether it be Halloween or Christmas. She went to the top. There was always a party going over there.
Hi, Uncle Dylan. Waving.
My sister's boyfriend actually worked with me building houses, so I picked him up every morning for work. We kind of thought we could be together forever.
911, where's your emergency?
The call came out that there was shots fired between 2 motorists.
Okay, I gotta put you on hold a second. Hold on 1 second for me. We'll get somebody dispatched over there.
At that point, we didn't have much information, just that there was a woman that had been shot and was in distress.
Please tell me she's gonna be okay. She's been shot. Please tell me she's gonna be okay. Please help her, please. There's kids in the car, please.
It was kind of chaotic. I recall seeing a woman laying on the ground next to her vehicle. Fire had started life-saving measures.
Are you all right? Are you all right? How many people are in
There was a juvenile female that was in the car, along with 2 infants in the back seat of the vehicle. We got the children out of the car and away from the incident so they didn't have to see what was occurring.
Please, please, please.
You get a gunshot wound like that to the chest, it's a hard thing to live through.
It's okay.
That was terrible. They were completely panicked. We were still trying to figure out how they were related to the victim, trying to figure out who to call, next of kin, or a family member that could come, pick up the kids.
It just happened so fast. Is she gonna be okay?
We really didn't know what had happened.
What's your name? Whitney.
Police learn that the victim is Whitney Gray, and the other occupants are her children and teenage niece.
Find Johnson, start talking to witnesses.
We went out and located witnesses that were still on scene and started interviewing them so that we could have information to give to detectives when they arrived.
Good. We got multiple witnesses on scene here.
We're getting information that there was some kind of an altercation.
I only heard 1 gunshot. She was the driver. He cut her off or something, and then I heard the shot. I was behind him, and then I seen him speed off, and then I just pulled over. He was in a white truck or a white SUV.
Witnesses describe someone in a large white vehicle opening fire on Whitney's car and driving away.
We had no idea why this had all transpired.
Police call in a team of detectives to take charge of the investigation.
By the time I had arrived on the scene, she had already passed. Miss Gray had been shot in the middle of her chest. It was just a bullseye right in the middle.
Whitney Gray's vehicle was slightly off the road in the front yard of a residence. You could see a bullet hole in the windshield of the vehicle.
We knew it was likely a handgun that had been used.
Further along the road, investigators recover a bullet casing.
Shooting occurred around a couple of blocks south. And then her vehicle actually traveled across some railroad tracks and then came to rest in a yard of a home.
Stop! Please! It's my sister, please! Get on the floor! Get on the floor! Please! Punch him on your head! Please!
My niece called me and she was screaming, "She's been shot, she's been shot." When I pulled up, all I seen was the van up in somebody's front yard, and the paramedics had my sister out laying on her back. It was pretty chaotic. People, ambulances, babies crying, it was a mess. There was no rationality in my mind at all. It was just, I have to get to my sister. And then when I knew that when they told me it was that she didn't make it, I just needed to be there holding them kids. I just wanted to be with my family. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, was to put a straight face on and tell the kids that I loved them and everything's gonna be all right. I called my dad. I could hear him breaking pieces.
Everything kind of went numb at that point.
It was just a sickening feeling. Like, what in the world? What are those boys gonna do?
She was the life of everything. She was that glue that held the whole family together.
Once we had the scene secured, we began an area canvass. Told a couple officers to go out and start knocking on doors and seeing if anybody had any surveillance cameras on their houses. We were able to locate a house north of the incident that had surveillance footage.
Detective Todd Winborn arrives to assist the investigation.
When I got to the scene, we were just going kind of blindly at the time. We started looking at surveillance video to see if they captured anything that would lead us to suspect.
Okay, can you start it just after 7:30 p.m.?
Detectives look out for Whitney's silver van.
House, we got lucky that they had a very good security system.
Fast forward.
The house has 3 cameras covering different parts of the road, a few hundred yards from the crash site.
Okay, fast forward.
This was a whodunit. And when you finally see a good lead on a suspect, it changes the whole investigation.
Wait, what's this? Rewind that.
The video was blurry and pixelated.
That's Whitney's car.
You see traffic going northbound on Sterling. And then this SUV kind of just slowly coming to a stop and kind of hitting the curb on the east side of the road and coming to a rest.
Can you zoom in here?
The video showed her coming to a stop, after the shooting had occurred.
Okay, just rewind this.
They take the footage back to just before Whitney's car appears at 7:38 p.m.
We knew because of the witnesses that the suspect vehicle would have to be in front of the victim's vehicle. Kind of suspect vehicle we were looking for was a light colored SUV, and he had to have gone by this camera.
Rewind that.
There was a large white vehicle running through that same area at the time that the vehicle was coming to a stop.
You punch in on the car here. Pause it.
The make model was a little shaky, but we knew it was a pretty good sized SUV.
They check the other cameras for a clear image of the suspect vehicle.
We were hoping that we could get a license plate to start tracking down a person of interest.
Can't make it out.
It was moving too quickly. We paused the video, and there was no real evidence that we could gain from that. But it gave us a timestamp on what time we need to look for and told us which direction she was going on Sterling from Winter Road.
Back at the department, investigators turn to Whitney's niece for more information.
She was in complete shock. That was probably will be the worst day of her life.
Can you try and take us through what happened? She told us that a vehicle was kind of tailgating them, passed them abruptly, very closely on the side, and that she had tossed a cup of water at the vehicle as it was passing.
There was an argument that had occurred, and she said when they pulled up to the light, she just heard the pop and then saw that her aunt was injured.
Do you have any idea who could have done this?
No.
Frequently homicides, whoever committed the crime, they're a partner or a business partner or some sort of associate. She was able to tell us we don't know who this person was.
Where have you been this evening?
We were at the grocery store getting things for dinner.
Part of the evidentiary photos were some grocery sacks from Price Chopper. We're taking a shot in the dark that she was at the Price Chopper at 23rd and Sterling.
We knew that particular grocery store did have surveillance.
We wanted to make sure there was no incidents in the Price Chopper. Was someone in there that might have sparked this, an argument, disagreement?
Detective Draveling heads to the Price Chopper to view their surveillance footage.
Show me everything you got around 7 o'clock.
There were several angles of video surveillance from the Price Chopper.
Show me the camera over the entrance. Stop.
Punch in. That's her.
We were able to see video of her and her niece shopping in that store.
Follow her around.
We were able to watch her all throughout the store, looking for immediate suspects.
If we would have seen Whitney in the grocery store with a guy or arguing with somebody, we're gonna try to find this guy.
She had no arguments, disagreements, not even close to anyone in the store that would have prompted this homicide to occur.
Okay, let's go to exterior camera.
You can see her leave the store. Loaded the groceries up. Get in her van.
Punch in on the car.
You can see her pull out into the intersection to the red light facing north.
Look at that. Can you rewind? Punch in.
She pulled sort of in front of a vehicle that was coming at a high rate of speed.
You see the SUV nosediving, which tells me that he's hitting his brakes.
I thought this might be our suspect.
Can you get any closer?
You have an urgency to identify the vehicle, identify the suspect, get as much information as you can.
It's just not clear enough.
Because the longer you wait, the harder it is to track down these suspects.
Is that Taco Bell across the road?
Yep.
Drevlin, get yourself to Taco Bell and check the cameras.
Detectives hope the Taco Bell cameras will give them a closer look at the suspect car.
Once we got there, Detective Drevlin gives me a timestamp of what Price Chopper's time is.
Started at 7:30 p.m.
Can you rewind?
Pause it. Zoom in.
We see our victim's vehicle being followed very closely by this same white SUV.
Can you zoom in?
I watched my Taco Bell video probably a dozen times just to try to see if I could pause it in the right direction, to see if I could see any distinguishable mark on the vehicle. License plates, broken headlight, taillights.
It's no good.
So it didn't yield anything spectacular to us for evidence.
You have a 22-year-old victim that has young children, and her life is ended over something that appears pretty senseless. You don't know what this suspect is going to do to anyone else. You've got to protect everybody, and to do that, you have to figure out who the suspect is and apprehend them.
Whitney's family wait for news on the investigation.
You want them to find the person that did this.
We didn't know if this was going to be one of them cold cases like so many others around here.
I didn't have a whole lot of faith. I mean, you hear about shootings all the time, and you just don't.
She touched a lot of people in her life, her short life. We had a lot of support from the friends wanting to know if there was anything they could do or if we needed anything. We all came together as a big family. But it was like hell.
Early the next morning, we had a briefing.
The grill matches up completely with the Tahoe.
All hands on deck were looking at this surveillance video, and everybody had an opinion about what this large SUV was.
As we're looking up different makes and models on our phones and computers,
Toyota Sequoia.
Detective traveling is like, this is a Toyota Sequoia.
The common model of car means their suspect will be even harder to track down.
Our plan was to continue the search for more video. In the Price Chopper grocery store video, he's coming from the south to the north. Let's just keep going south. We checked several places along the way. There are several grocery stores and a lot of residences and apartment buildings.
All of which didn't show anything, or the video wasn't good enough to show anything, or the video wasn't recording. After coming up short on finding any more information, we decided to maybe broaden it a little more.
Now you're getting to be 3 or 4 miles south.
We went on Sterling from where the incident happened to a Quick Trip.
They're a gas station, but they have everything. You know, it's groceries and fast food and you name it. Super popular. Quick Trip also have cutting-edge surveillance video.
Excuse me. Camera's working?
We arrived at the Quick Trip, which was going to be the last day it was going to be open. They were demolishing the Quick Trip the very next day to build a new one.
So it was a long shot.
Quick Trip manager signs into the computer and lets us operate and look at whatever video we want.
Okay, let's start from 7:30.
This is 3 or 4 miles south of the Price Chopper. Thousands of cars are in and through that intersection in that Quick Trip every day. So it was definitely a leap of faith.
They queue it up to 10 minutes before the shooting.
There, look. Right away, Detective Traveling sees a white SUV pull into the Quick Trip parking lot.
You got another angle? I can't believe you'd park right there.
We were able to see that it was obviously a white Toyota Sequoia parked right under a high-definition camera.
There's the old saying, I'd rather be lucky than good, and it was very true that day.
Gotcha.
Get out of the car, come on.
white male gets out of the vehicle.
He was wearing like a driving cap and a t-shirt and jeans.
Pause it. Punch in. It's just not clear enough. Let's turn to the internal cameras. Pause it right there. Punch in.
We're getting clear shots of this subject walking to the back, kind of cooler section of the store. Since the store is being torn down tomorrow, they've kind of been liquidating merchandise.
A lot of the shelves that would normally contain groceries and things are empty.
Let's rewind it.
After he looks into the glass, you can kind of see the demeanor change a little bit. He doesn't select anything. Leaves empty-handed and walks out of the store.
Get another angle. There's our man. Freeze it. Gotcha.
We now have high-definition images of his face, what he looks like, his haircut, his clothes, his build. We're looking for a white male. He had, like a goatee or facial hair. The resolution of the video left no doubt that whenever we found this person, it was going to be obvious who it was. You can tell, even in the silent video, that he's upset. He storms out of the store. Based on the timestamp of that video, that was just minutes prior to him encountering Whitney Gray at the intersection of 23rd and Sterling. So we know that he was already sort of in a bad mood.
I was able to pause the video, take a screenshot, and then send an image of the driver to the guys at the office.
Let's see if we can get a clear shot at that license plate.
Push in.
We got him.
I could read the license plate from the video surveillance. A few moments later, he exits the parking lot and heads north on Sterling towards the area of the price chopper.
We went from, it could be virtually anyone in the world, to it's this person in a matter of seconds. We ran the license plate number, and the computer revealed an apartment in Independence. It matched up to a person named James Taylor.
I need a surveillance unit as soon as possible.
So we made a plan to dispatch some undercover police officers to conduct surveillance on this particular apartment. Back to the police station, there is a lot of us just on pins and needles.
You got eyes on him yet?
It's in. Go, go, go! Please, go, go! Arms up!
When the undercover detectives talked to James Taylor, he said something along the lines of, "Oh, you're probably looking for my son, Chris."
James Taylor, he agrees to come to the station voluntarily to speak with Detective Brashears and myself.
You know, it's so hard for me to to think that I have a son that's wanted for something like this.
He had seen the 5 o'clock morning news and seen the clip that we had released to the media. He was pretty emotional, but he didn't seem shocked.
He's an adult. He's been an adult for a long time, Mr. Taylor.
I know. And I keep telling myself, you know, that once he left the house, I had no way of stopping what he did.
James Taylor described his son Christopher as being anti-government, kind of referred to him as being a prepper, a survivalist, and wanted to kind of be off the grid. Not a real social person, as he put it.
Even up to the point where when he went into the service, he didn't have any outlook ahead of him, you know, and then he went in the service and he really wanted to be in there. You know, that was one of the things that just astounded me, that he wanted to go in. He enlisted. And we thought that, you know,
that's an honorable thing to do.
Yes, yes. And then when he came out, he went right to work.
Yeah.
And so we thought everything was cool. They just don't have a flashing light on them, do they? It says, I'm turning.
We obviously wanted to know where Chris was, and James told us that he didn't know, but that a lot of his personal property, along with the Toyota Sequoia, was gone. The natural question for us was, what do you mean, what was missing?
One handgun, one .556 caliber rifle, numerous camping items, survival type items.
We were told that he would be hiding from us, maybe in the woods. Now we're kind of back to a needle in a haystack again.
The hardest thing I've ever had to do is to sit and talk about my son like this.
Once they had all the information about who Mr. Taylor was and the potentiality of him being extremely well armed, there was a lot of danger if they tried to arrest this man.
In my mind, I was thinking, our time's limited to locate this guy because he will be off the grid and no way to track him down. And we don't know what he's going to do next or who his next victim will be.
Detective Draveling asked, is his Toyota Sequoia paid for? It turns out that he bought it from a local buy here, pay here car lot. And buy here, pay here car lots are notorious for putting GPS on the cars that they sell in the event that the payments aren't made so they can recover them. We called this particular car lot, and it was close to closing time.
I need to speak to your manager.
They came back and said, well, it's odd because it looks like he's off of Interstate 90 in Box Elder, South Dakota. We're thinking, well, he's running. Christopher Taylor made it all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota. He's only a few hours now from the Rocky Mountains. The exact location was likely a La Quinta hotel, and so we called the Rapid City Police Department. They sprung into action immediately.
Back at the police department, detectives listen in to the operation.
The South Dakota law enforcement sent a SWAT team and officers and detectives to the La Quinta. And sure enough, there's that white Toyota Sequoia parked out front. Christopher Taylor had registered to a room under his own name. They placed a sniper in a position to watch Mr. Taylor's window of his room. The Rapid City SWAT team officers went room to room and quietly asked the other guests to leave.
We were worried. We had taken a lot of guns, a lot of ammunition. We feared he was going up there to make a shootout and make a last stand.
So they came up with a brilliant game plan to get Christopher Taylor out of the room and try to keep everybody as safe as possible.
The plan is to stage a car crash by ramming Taylor's vehicle.
We can't believe what they're doing. Called his room and said, hey, this is the front desk, and we're so sorry, but there's been an accident in the parking lot.
Please, don't move. Arms up. Turn around. Turn around.
So definitely high fives and fist bumps in our office once we knew he was safely in custody.
They took the vehicle into custody also. And inside the vehicle, there were the weapons.
Chris Taylor had taken thousands of rounds of ammunition. Multiple firearms, rifles, handguns, bows and arrows. A few hours later, Rapid City called me back and said he confessed to shooting Whitney Gray.
At court, surveillance footage helps prosecutors lay out the events leading to Whitney Gray's death. After failing to find what he wants at the Quick Trip, Christopher Taylor drives away at speed. Minutes later, outside the Price Chopper, he brakes hard behind Whitney Gray's emerging car. He then pulls alongside Whitney and confronts her.
What are you doing? There's kids in the car!
He just blew his fuse after the cup of water was thrown at his vehicle and he fired a shot.
The niece managed to grab the steering wheel and was able to guide the car to a safe landing spot, which saved her and her baby cousins from being hurt as well.
Without the video surveillance in this case, I don't know that it would have been solved. Christopher Taylor might not be in custody to this day. He could be in the wilderness up north in the mountains, who knows?
In court, the defense convinces a jury that the shooting was involuntary. They argue that Taylor panicked and that muscle memory developed through military training makes him pull the trigger.
Christopher was sentenced to 7 years for involuntary manslaughter and 17 years for armed criminal action, to be served together.
Should have been murder. How ridiculous that this is to say that your reaction to someone throwing a cup of water on your car is to pull out a .40 caliber handgun and fire it at a car full of kids.
It just wasn't fair. We just couldn't understand how they could even come up with that.
It was senseless, as homicides are. Sad, frustrating, and senseless, and this definitely was all of that.
A massive hole's been left. We all get together for her birthdays and let the kids write messages on balloons and send them off to her.
She loved her kids with everything she had. I mean, with everything. I mean, she would stand in a snowstorm to make sure that her kids stayed comfortable. I mean, that's just the person that she was.
I see a lot of her in them every day. Whether it's a face she makes or something she says or something she does. Whitney would be so proud of them. The boys ask about her. They want to know when their mommy's going to come back and see them.
She's unconscious.
unconscious, correct?
Yeah, she's laying face down in her own blood.
You know, the door's opening and they're being met with lead being fired out of a gun.
He was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
He set you up. Straight up. Set you up.
On the evening of December 24th, 1991, the island of Hawaii was, in many ways, like any other place on the brink of a holiday night. It was Christmas Eve, a time when families gathered, when streets slowly emptied, and when the world seemed to narrow into the quiet routines of home, food, and familiar voices. But beneath that surface of seasonal stillness, something else was unfolding in a far more isolated part of the Big Island, in an area where light was sparse, roads were uneven, and the distance between houses could feel much larger than it appeared on a map. It was here, in this quiet geography of dirt roads and scattered residences, that a young woman named Dana Ireland set out on a bicycle ride that would become the center of one of Hawaii's most disturbing and controversial criminal cases. Dana Ireland was 23 years old at the time. She lived on the Big Island of Hawaii, a place known for its vast landscapes and contrasting environments, where developed areas could quickly give way to stretches of near isolation. She was described as active and physically engaged with her surroundings, someone who enjoyed cycling and made it part of her routine life. On that December evening, she did what she had done before. She went out alone on her bicycle. There was nothing in that moment that would have suggested the scale of what was about to unfold, nothing that would have marked the night as different from any other ride through familiar roads. And yet, this was the moment that would later be examined, questioned, reconstructed, and argued over for decades. The area where Dana Ireland was cycling, near Orchidland Estates on the Big Island, was not a densely populated urban environment. It was characterized by its sparse distribution of homes, its relatively low levels of artificial lighting, and its quiet stretches of road that could feel empty even when not entirely so. In such environments, visibility is limited, and the presence of others is often uncertain. A cyclist traveling alone would be moving through a landscape where shadows stretch further, where sound carries differently, and where isolation is not just a feeling but a physical reality. On that night, these conditions formed the backdrop to what would later be understood as a violent and tragic sequence of events. At some point during her ride, Dana Ireland was struck by a vehicle while she was still on her bicycle. This collision was the beginning of a chain of events that investigators would later attempt to piece together from fragmented evidence and physical traces. The impact did not end her life immediately. According to the reconstructed understanding of the incident, she remained alive after the collision. What followed was a series of actions that transformed a traffic-related incident into a violent crime. She was moved from the initial location into a more concealed area, away from immediate view and the openness of the roadway. In this concealed space, the situation escalated further. Dana Ireland was subjected to a severe sexual assault. After this, she was beaten, and these combined acts ultimately resulted in her death. The sequence, as understood through later investigation, indicates a progression from collision to concealment, from injury to assault, and finally to fatal violence. The clarity of this sequence, however, is something that was not immediately available to investigators at the time. Instead, what they were left with was a scene disrupted and altered, making it difficult to reconstruct the exact order of events with certainty in the early stages of the investigation. Following the incident, there were attempts to interfere with or conceal the evidence of what had occurred. The scene itself had been disturbed in ways that complicated the initial understanding of what had taken place. This act of disruption would become one of the central challenges for law enforcement, as they tried to determine not only what happened to Dana Ireland, but also how and in what order those events unfolded. The physical environment, already difficult due to its rural and uneven nature, now held additional layers of confusion introduced by the aftermath of the crime. When Dana Ireland's body was eventually discovered, the condition in which she was found reflected the severity of the violence she had experienced. The injuries indicated multiple forms of trauma. There were signs consistent with impact from a vehicle, injuries consistent with physical assault, and evidence suggesting sexual violence. These overlapping forms of trauma made it difficult for investigators to immediately separate and sequence the events. The scene did not present a clear narrative. Instead, it presented fragments of a narrative that needed to be reconstructed carefully, step by step, under conditions that were far from ideal. In the early 1990s, forensic science was not at the level of development it would later reach. DNA analysis, which would eventually become central in many criminal investigations, was not yet a reliable or widely applicable tool in the early stages of this case. As a result, investigators relied heavily on physical interpretation of the scene and on witness accounts. However, those witness accounts were not stable or fully consistent, adding another layer of uncertainty. The investigation moved forward, but it moved forward in an environment where certainty was limited and where many of the foundational elements of modern forensic clarity were not yet available. As time passed, the case did not reach an immediate resolution. Instead, it continued to develop over years, with investigators revisiting evidence and reevaluating earlier interpretations. The lack of a clear and immediate suspect meant that the case remained open, unresolved, and increasingly complex. In cases like this, time can both reveal and obscure as memories fade, evidence degrades, and early assumptions become harder to verify. The investigation into Dana Ireland's death was no exception to this pattern. It evolved slowly, with shifting focus and emerging questions that would later reshape its direction entirely. Eventually, attention began to focus on specific individuals, and the case entered a new phase in which accusations were directed toward 3 men. This development marked a significant shift in the trajectory of the investigation. What had once been an open-ended search for answers became a structured legal pursuit involving named suspects and formal charges. However, even at this stage, the case was far from straightforward. Questions surrounding the reliability of evidence, particularly in relation to forensic material, began to surface. The process of connecting individuals to the crime scene was not universally accepted as clear or uncontested. As the investigation progressed into legal proceedings, the case of Dana Ireland became more than just a criminal investigation. It became a subject of dispute, scrutiny, and long-term debate. Issues surrounding how evidence had been collected, how it had been interpreted, and how conclusions had been reached began to emerge. These concerns would later contribute to ongoing discussions about whether the correct individuals had been held responsible and whether the original investigation had accurately captured the truth of what happened on that December night. But at the center of all of this remained the same foundational reality. A young woman had gone out cycling on Christmas Eve. She had been alone on a rural road in a sparsely lit area of the Big Island. She had been struck by a vehicle, moved from that initial point, and subjected to a sequence of violence that ended her life. And in the aftermath of that event, a complex and evolving investigation had begun, one that would stretch across decades and continue to raise questions long after the initial shock of the crime had faded. This is where the story begins, not with answers, but with absence. Not with resolution, but with a series of unanswered questions emerging from a quiet road on a holiday night. The kind of night that should have ended uneventfully, but instead became the starting point of a case that would challenge investigators, divide opinion, and remain part of Hawaii's criminal history for years to come. To understand what happened to Dana Ireland, it is necessary to step back from the violence of the incident itself and look more closely at the world she was moving through before that moment ever occurred. In true crime cases, the focus often shifts rapidly toward the event, toward the mechanics of injury and investigation, toward suspects and evidence and courtroom arguments. But before all of that exists a quieter reality, one defined not by crime, but by routine. In this case, that routine belonged to a 23-year-old woman living on the Big Island of Hawaii, a place where geography itself shapes daily life in ways that are both ordinary and deeply influential. Dana Ireland was, by all available accounts, an active young woman. She lived on the Big Island, a region of Hawaii known for its vast and varied landscapes, where communities can be separated by long stretches of open land, and where travel between places often involves moving through areas that feel removed from dense urban structure. Her life included cycling, an activity that placed her directly into this environment rather than keeping her separated from it. Cycling, in this context, is not simply exercise. It is a way of moving through space that exposes a person to distance, to weather, to terrain, and to the quiet unpredictability of isolated roads. The Big Island itself is not uniform. It contains developed areas, but also long rural corridors where homes are spread far apart and where lighting is limited or absent once daylight fades. These conditions create a particular kind of environment for anyone traveling alone, especially at night. Even during normal circumstances, the feeling of distance can become more pronounced when visibility is reduced and when human presence is minimal. It is within this broader environmental reality that Dana Ireland's cycling routine took place. On December 24, 1991, she was 23 years old. That fact alone is often repeated in accounts of the case because it anchors the tragedy in a stage of life that is typically associated with movement, independence, and forward momentum. She was not engaged in anything unusual that evening. She was doing what she had done before, riding her bicycle through familiar areas of the Big Island. The repetition of that routine is important because it emphasizes the absence of warning signs, the lack of deviation from normal behavior, and the unpredictability of what followed. The area near Orchidland Estates, where she was cycling, is described in investigative context as relatively sparse in population density. It is not a tightly packed residential zone, but rather a space where homes and structures are spread apart, connected by roads that may not always be well lit. In such environments, movement becomes more dependent on natural light during the day and becomes more vulnerable to isolation during the night. When darkness falls, the relationship between visibility and distance changes significantly. Objects and movement become harder to identify, and the sense of separation between points on a road can feel amplified. For a cyclist, these conditions matter in very practical ways. A bicycle is a vehicle that does not provide enclosure or protection. It places the rider in direct contact with the environment, with no barrier between the body and surrounding space. In areas with limited lighting, the rider's awareness of surroundings becomes heavily dependent on immediate perception, sound, and the faint illumination that may exist from distant sources. This is not unique to Dana Ireland's case, but it forms part of the environmental structure in which her final ride took place. Her presence on the road that night was not unusual in itself. Cycling as an activity was part of her routine life. The key detail, from an investigative standpoint, is that she was alone. Solo travel in isolated areas introduces a different set of vulnerabilities, not because it implies risk in itself, but because it reduces the presence of external witnesses and reduces the likelihood that any unexpected event will be observed directly by others. In this case, that isolation would later become a critical factor in how the incident was reconstructed and understood. What is known about Dana Ireland in this case is limited to her age, her activity level, and her engagement in cycling. These details may appear minimal, but in true crime reconstruction, even minimal biographical information plays a significant role in establishing baseline behavior. It allows investigators to differentiate between routine actions and deviations from routine. In this instance, there is no indication that her decision to go cycling on that evening was out of character. Instead, it aligns with a pattern of active movement through her environment. The environment itself, however, was not passive. The Big Island's rural areas, particularly those with limited infrastructure, create conditions where roads can extend through relatively empty stretches of land. Orchidland Estates is one such area, where residential development exists but does not eliminate the presence of open, less populated space. Roads in such areas may not have consistent lighting, and the transition between inhabited and uninhabited space can feel abrupt. This combination of factors shapes the experience of anyone traveling through it at night. In reconstructing the context of Dana Ireland's final ride, investigators would later have to consider how these environmental conditions interacted with the events that followed. But at the time of her disappearance, none of this broader reconstruction was yet available. What existed was only the fact of her absence after a routine activity. That absence would soon shift into a search, and then into a recovery, and eventually into a criminal investigation that would span decades. The significance of her cycling route also lies in its familiarity. Routine paths are often chosen precisely because they are known. Familiarity reduces uncertainty in navigation and creates a sense of predictability in movement. Yet in isolated environments, familiarity does not eliminate external risk factors. The same road that feels predictable in daylight can feel entirely different under limited visibility. In such conditions, perception becomes narrower and awareness of surroundings becomes more immediate and less comprehensive. Dana Ireland's age and activity level also contribute to how the case is understood in terms of vulnerability and expectation. At 23, she was in a stage of life where physical activity and independence are often central. Cycling alone reflects a level of comfort with movement through her environment. There is no indication in the available information that she anticipated anything unusual on that evening. The absence of anticipation is an important element in how the case is later understood, because it underscores the suddenness with which routine can be disrupted. It is also important to note that nothing in her background, as presented in the case information, suggests involvement in any conflict or circumstance that would predict what occurred later. This absence of known conflict is part of what made the investigation challenging from the beginning. When a violent event occurs without an immediately apparent motive or preceding conflict, investigators must rely more heavily on physical evidence and environmental reconstruction. The Big Island itself, as the setting, plays a continuous role in shaping the narrative. Its size and diversity mean that it contains both developed and undeveloped regions, often in close proximity. This creates transitions between populated and isolated areas that can happen over relatively short distances. In the case of Dana Ireland's cycling route, these transitions are part of the environment she was moving through. The road near Orchidland Estates represents one of those transitional spaces where residential presence exists but does not fully define the surroundings. In many ways, the importance of this context becomes clearer only in hindsight. At the moment of her ride, there was no indication that this particular stretch of road would become the center of a major criminal investigation. It was simply part of the landscape she was traveling through. But after the events that followed, every detail of that landscape would be re-examined through the lens of forensic inquiry and legal scrutiny. What remains consistent across all available information is the simplicity of her action that evening. She rode a bicycle alone on a rural road in Hawaii on Christmas Eve. From that simple act, a sequence of events unfolded that would later involve collision, injury, violence, and a prolonged investigation. But in this stage of the narrative, before those events are described, what stands out most is the normalcy of what came before. This normalcy is often the most important element in true crime analysis because it emphasizes the gap between expectation and outcome. Nothing in the description of Dana Ireland's routine suggests that her actions were unusual. Nothing suggests that the environment was perceived as immediately threatening in a way that would alter her behavior. Instead, what exists is a straightforward alignment between person and routine activity, occurring within a broader geographic context that would later be scrutinized in detail. By the time the investigation into her disappearance began, this simplicity would already be gone. It would be replaced by questions, by reconstruction, and by attempts to interpret fragmented evidence. But at the center of all those later developments remains this foundational reality: a young woman cycling alone on a familiar road in a rural part of the Big Island on a holiday evening, moving through a landscape that would soon become the focus of one of Hawaii's most complex and controversial criminal cases. On December 24, 1991, Dana Ireland left on a bicycle ride that, at the time, appeared entirely consistent with her normal routine. There was nothing in the available record to suggest hesitation, deviation, or anticipation of danger. She entered a rural road network on the Big Island of Hawaii, moving through an environment defined by low population density and limited lighting. What followed would later be reconstructed through investigative work, physical evidence, and contested interpretation, but the immediate sequence of events remains anchored in a small number of established facts. She was struck by a vehicle while riding her bicycle. That moment marked the beginning of a chain of events that transformed a routine activity into a violent and fatal case. The collision itself is understood as the initial physical disruption in the sequence. Dana Ireland, while cycling, was impacted by a car. The force of that impact did not result in immediate death. This detail is central to how the case was later reconstructed because it establishes that there was a period of time after the collision during which she was still alive. In investigative terms, this period becomes critical because it separates the incident into stages rather than a single instantaneous event. The transition from collision to subsequent actions forms the core of the case's complexity. Following the impact, the situation did not resolve in place. Instead, Dana Ireland was moved from the initial collision site into a more concealed area. This relocation is an important element in the established sequence, as it indicates an intentional effort to remove her from immediate visibility. The exact method of this movement is not detailed in the available information, but the outcome is clear. She was no longer located at the original point of collision. Instead, she was found later in a different area, one that was less exposed and more difficult to observe from the surrounding environment. Once in this concealed location, the situation escalated further. Dana Ireland was subjected to a severe sexual assault. This act is documented as part of the sequence of violence that occurred after the initial collision and relocation. It represents a shift from the earlier physical trauma of the vehicle impact to a different form of intentional harm. The combination of these events creates a layered structure of violence, beginning with accidental or intentional collision, followed by movement, and then followed by further assault. After the sexual assault, the violence continued. Dana Ireland was beaten, and these injuries ultimately resulted in her death. The progression from injury to assault to fatal beating is central to how investigators later understood the case. It was not a single act, but a sequence of escalating violence occurring within a relatively short period of time. Each stage added to the severity of the situation and contributed to the complexity of reconstructing the exact order of events after the fact. At some point following the death, there were actions taken that indicated an attempt to interfere with or conceal evidence. The scene was disturbed in a way that made it more difficult for investigators to immediately interpret what had occurred. This disturbance did not erase the physical reality of the crime, but it did complicate the clarity of its reconstruction. In cases where multiple forms of trauma are present, scene integrity is essential for establishing sequence, and here that integrity was compromised. The environment in which these events occurred also played a significant role in the difficulty of reconstruction. The area near Orchidland Estates is not characterized by dense surveillance or high visibility. It is a rural setting with roads that may lack consistent lighting and where natural terrain can limit lines of sight. In such an environment, the absence of witnesses is not unusual, and the ability to observe events in real time is reduced. This environmental condition became a factor in why the case initially lacked immediate clarity. When Dana Ireland's body was eventually discovered, investigators were faced with a scene that contained multiple overlapping indicators of trauma. There were injuries consistent with a vehicle impact, suggesting the initial collision. There were also injuries consistent with physical assault, indicating violence beyond the collision itself. In addition, there were signs consistent with sexual assault. The presence of these different categories of injury created a complex forensic picture, one that did not easily present a single linear narrative without careful analysis. One of the central challenges in the early stages of understanding the case was the condition of the scene itself. It had been disturbed, which meant that the original arrangement of evidence was no longer intact. In forensic investigation, the spatial relationship between evidence items is often as important as the items themselves. When that relationship is disrupted, reconstructing the sequence of events becomes significantly more difficult. In this case, that difficulty was present from the beginning of the investigative process. At the time of the incident in 1991, forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, was not yet at a level where it could be consistently used as a primary investigative tool in complex cases. As a result, early investigative work relied heavily on physical interpretation and witness statements. However, witness statements in this case were not stable or fully consistent, adding another layer of uncertainty. Without reliable forensic confirmation, investigators were required to work with incomplete and sometimes ambiguous information. The initial investigative approach involved attempts to piece together the sequence of events from the physical evidence available at the scene. This included examining the nature of the injuries, the location where the body was found, and any trace evidence that could be recovered. However, the combination of environmental conditions, scene disturbance, and limited forensic technology meant that early conclusions were not definitive. The case did not produce an immediate or clear suspect in its earliest phase. Over time, the investigation continued, but the lack of resolution meant that the case remained open and active without a final conclusion. In such situations, investigative focus can shift as new information emerges or as existing evidence is reinterpreted. In the case of Dana Ireland, this shifting focus eventually led investigators to consider specific individuals as potential suspects. However, at the stage of the incident itself, there was no immediate identification of those individuals. What remained consistent throughout the early reconstruction was the recognition that the event sequence began with a collision and ended with fatal violence, with intermediate stages involving relocation and assault. The challenge was not in identifying that a crime had occurred, but in determining the precise details of how and by whom it had been carried out. The physical evidence confirmed the occurrence of multiple forms of trauma, but it did not immediately resolve the identity of those responsible. The complexity of the scene also meant that investigators had to consider multiple possible interpretations of the evidence. The presence of both vehicle-related injuries and non-vehicle-related injuries required careful separation of cause and effect. Determining which injuries occurred first and how they related to each other was essential for reconstructing the timeline. However, because the scene had been disturbed, that reconstruction was not straightforward. In addition to physical reconstruction, investigators also had to rely on contextual understanding of the area where the incident occurred. Rural environments like Orchidland Estates do not provide the same level of external documentation as urban environments. There are fewer surveillance systems, fewer immediate witnesses, and fewer recorded points of reference. This lack of external data sources meant that the investigation was more dependent on physical evidence recovered after the fact. As the investigation moved forward in the months and years following the incident, the initial sequence of events remained largely unchanged in its core structure. Dana Ireland was cycling. She was struck by a vehicle. She was moved from the scene. She was subjected to sexual assault. She was beaten and died as a result of her injuries. Her body was later discovered in a disturbed environment with multiple forms of trauma present. These facts formed the foundation of the case, as it was understood at its most basic level. However, while the sequence remained consistent, the interpretation of responsibility for each stage of that sequence would later become the subject of legal dispute and forensic reevaluation. At the time of the incident itself, none of those later legal developments had yet occurred. What existed was a scene of violence, an incomplete reconstruction, and an ongoing investigation that had not yet reached resolution. In this way, the incident phase of the Dana Ireland case is defined not only by what happened but also by what was not yet known. It is defined by the gap between physical evidence and interpretive certainty. It is defined by the challenge of reconstructing a sequence of human actions from a disrupted environment under technological limitations that would later be overcome but were not available at the time. The events of that Christmas Eve night would eventually become one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in Hawaii, not because the sequence itself was unclear in its broad outline, but because the details surrounding responsibility, evidence interpretation, and investigative procedure would later be questioned extensively. But at the moment of the incident, none of that future complexity existed. There was only a collision on a rural road, a sequence of violence that followed, and a case that had just begun its long path toward investigation, controversy, and legal reconsideration. After the discovery of Dana Ireland's body and the initial attempts to reconstruct what had happened on December 24, 1991, the case entered a long and complicated investigative phase that would span years and eventually decades. From the very beginning, law enforcement in Hawaii was faced with a crime scene that did not present itself in a clean or easily interpretable form. The combination of multiple types of trauma, environmental conditions, and scene disturbance created a situation where every piece of evidence required careful interpretation, yet certainty was difficult to achieve. What followed was an investigation shaped by limitations in forensic technology, reliance on human memory, and evolving investigative priorities that would later become central to the controversy surrounding the case. One of the earliest and most significant challenges was the condition in which Dana Ireland's body and the surrounding scene were found. The injuries reflected multiple forms of trauma, including those consistent with a vehicle impact, those consistent with physical assault, and those consistent with sexual violence. Each of these categories required different investigative frameworks, yet they were all present simultaneously. This overlap made it difficult for investigators to immediately determine the precise sequence of events. Establishing order in a crime of this nature is essential because the timeline determines how evidence is interpreted and how responsibility is assessed. In this case, the timeline was not immediately clear. Compounding this difficulty was the fact that the scene had been disturbed before investigators could fully document it in its original condition. Scene disturbance can occur for many reasons, including environmental exposure, movement of the body, or interference following the crime. Whatever the cause in this case, the result was the same. The original arrangement of evidence was no longer intact. For investigators, this meant that they were not working with a preserved snapshot of events, but rather with a reconstructed environment that had already been altered. This significantly reduced the clarity of early conclusions. In the early 1990s, forensic science was still in a transitional phase. DNA analysis existed, but it had not yet become the powerful and widely accessible tool that it would later become in criminal investigations. As a result, investigators in the Dana Ireland case had to rely heavily on more traditional forms of evidence interpretation. This included physical examination of the scene, analysis of injuries, and witness statements. Each of these methods carries inherent limitations. Physical interpretation can be affected by contamination or disturbance. Witness statements can be inconsistent or influenced by memory decay. Without strong forensic confirmation, investigative certainty becomes harder to achieve. Witness testimony in the early stages of the investigation did not provide a stable foundation for immediate resolution. Accounts were described as inconsistent or not fully reliable, which meant that investigators could not confidently build a timeline based solely on human recollection. In cases where physical evidence is fragmented, witness statements often play a crucial role in filling gaps. In this case, however, those gaps remained largely unfilled in the early phase, leaving investigators with an incomplete narrative structure. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement continued to analyze physical evidence from the scene. The goal was to separate the different stages of trauma and establish a coherent sequence of events. This involved examining the nature of the injuries, their likely causes, and how they might relate to one another. However, because multiple forms of trauma were present, each interpretation had to account for overlapping possibilities. For example, distinguishing injuries caused by the initial collision from those caused by subsequent violence required careful forensic reasoning, but the lack of clear preservation limited how definitive those conclusions could be. Over time, the investigation did not produce an immediate suspect. Instead, the case remained open and unresolved, gradually accumulating additional layers of inquiry. In long-term investigations like this, it is not uncommon for early leads to fade and for new theories to emerge as additional information is reviewed. In the Dana Ireland case, this process eventually led investigators to focus on 3 individuals, Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline Jr. This shift represented a significant turning point in the investigation, moving it from an open-ended inquiry into a more targeted legal direction. The process by which these individuals became central to the case was rooted in investigative conclusions drawn from available evidence at the time. However, the reliability and interpretation of that evidence would later become a point of major controversy. One of the central issues raised in subsequent legal discussions was the nature of the DNA evidence and how it was used in forming conclusions. At the time of the original investigation, DNA technology was not as advanced or as conclusive as it would later become, which meant that its role in early decision-making was limited and subject to later reinterpretation. As the investigation moved forward, charges were eventually brought against the three men. This marked the transition from investigative phase to legal proceedings. In a criminal case, this shift is critical because it moves the process from inquiry into formal accusation, where evidence must be presented and tested in a courtroom setting. However, even at this stage, the case was already marked by underlying disputes about the strength and clarity of the evidence. Questions had begun to emerge about whether the physical and forensic materials available were sufficient to support the conclusions being drawn. During the trial phase, the prosecution relied on the interpretation of available evidence to establish connections between the accused individuals and the crime. However, the defense and later legal scrutiny focused heavily on inconsistencies in the evidence and the possibility that the investigative process itself may have introduced errors. One of the key areas of contention involved DNA analysis. As forensic science advanced in the years following the initial investigation, new examinations of evidence led to renewed questions about whether earlier conclusions had been accurate. This created a situation where scientific advancement did not simply confirm earlier findings, but instead reopened them for reevaluation. The controversy surrounding the case was not limited to forensic evidence alone. It also extended to the methods used during the investigation, including how statements were obtained and how evidence was interpreted in the absence of modern technological tools. In complex criminal cases, especially those involving multiple forms of trauma and limited early forensic support, investigative interpretation plays a significant role. However, when those interpretations are later challenged by new scientific methods, the entire foundation of the case can come under review. As a result, the Dana Ireland case became one of the more widely discussed examples of potential wrongful conviction in the United States legal context. The focus of debate was not only on what happened on December 24, 1991, but also on how the investigation itself was conducted in the years that followed. The intersection between evolving forensic science and earlier investigative conclusions created a situation where certainty was difficult to maintain, even after legal proceedings had taken place. Another important aspect of this phase of the case was the passage of time. As years passed between the original incident and later legal reviews, the availability of evidence, the clarity of memory, and the consistency of documentation all became factors influencing the case's trajectory. Time can both preserve and erode information, and in this case, it contributed to increasing complexity rather than simplification. Evidence had to be re-examined under new standards, and earlier conclusions had to be reassessed in light of improved scientific understanding. Throughout this period, the case remained legally and emotionally significant. It was not only a matter of determining responsibility for a single crime, but also a broader question of how justice systems handle uncertainty, evolving technology, and the limits of early investigative tools. The involvement of DNA re-examination in the 2000s marked a particularly important stage, as it represented the application of newer scientific methods to older evidence, creating the possibility of reinterpretation and legal reconsideration. Ultimately, the investigation and legal proceedings in the Dana Ireland case illustrate the complexity of criminal reconstruction in situations where multiple forms of trauma, scene disturbance, and limited early forensic capability intersect. The early investigative phase was defined by fragmentation, uncertainty, and reliance on imperfect tools. The later legal phase was defined by challenge, reinterpretation, and the introduction of new scientific methods that questioned earlier conclusions. Between these phases lies the central tension of the case, the difficulty of achieving certainty in a system where both evidence and technology evolve over time. As the investigation into the death of Dana Ireland moved from its early uncertain stages into formal legal proceedings, the case entered one of its most controversial and closely examined phases. What had begun as a fragmented and difficult-to-interpret crime scene in 1991 gradually evolved into a courtroom process involving charges, trials, and convictions. Yet, even as the legal system attempted to impose structure and finality on the case, fundamental questions about evidence, interpretation, and reliability remained present throughout the proceedings. The transition from investigation to trial did not resolve the uncertainties of the case. Instead, it placed them under a different form of scrutiny, where each piece of evidence had to withstand legal challenge and procedural review. 3 men eventually became central figures in the prosecution's case: Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline Jr. Their involvement marked a decisive turning point in the case, shifting it from an open investigation into a targeted legal action. In criminal proceedings, the identification of defendants is not simply a procedural step, but a redefinition of the entire narrative. It transforms a set of unresolved facts into a structured accusation that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In the Dana Ireland case, this transformation occurred after years of investigation in which evidence had been gathered, reassessed, and interpreted under conditions that were already the subject of debate. The prosecution's case relied on the interpretation of physical evidence and investigative conclusions drawn from the original scene and subsequent analysis. The narrative presented in court was constructed around the established sequence of events: a collision involving a vehicle and a bicycle, the relocation of the victim, followed by sexual assault and fatal injuries. However, while the broad outline of events was not in dispute, the central question in the courtroom was not what happened in general terms, but who was responsible for each stage of that sequence. Establishing identity and causation became the core challenge of the legal process. One of the most significant issues that emerged during the trial phase was the nature of the forensic evidence, particularly DNA. At the time of the original investigation in 1991, DNA technology was not as advanced or as widely used as it would later become. As a result, early forensic conclusions were limited by the scientific capabilities of the period. By the time the case reached the courtroom, however, DNA evidence had become a more prominent and influential tool in criminal justice. This created a situation in which older evidence was being interpreted through newer scientific expectations, raising questions about consistency and reliability. The defense challenged the strength and interpretation of the evidence presented by the prosecution. A central theme of this challenge was the argument that the investigative process itself had introduced uncertainty. In complex cases where the crime scene has been disturbed and multiple forms of trauma are present, the risk of misinterpretation is significant. The defense argued that the conclusions drawn from the available evidence were not as definitive as they appeared, and that alternative interpretations had not been fully excluded. This line of argument focused not only on the evidence itself, but also on the methods used to collect, analyze, and interpret it. Another major point of contention during the legal proceedings involved witness statements and investigative reliability. Early in the case, witness accounts had been described as inconsistent or unstable. In court, the reliability of such statements became a critical issue, as the prosecution and defense evaluated their value in establishing a coherent timeline. In legal terms, witness testimony must be assessed not only for content but also for credibility, consistency, and alignment with physical evidence. In this case, the tension between human recollection and forensic interpretation added complexity to the proceedings. As the trial progressed, the court was required to evaluate whether the evidence presented met the standard of proof necessary for conviction. In criminal law, this standard is intentionally high, requiring that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt. This principle is designed to protect against wrongful conviction, particularly in cases where evidence may be incomplete or open to interpretation. In the Dana Ireland case, the defense emphasized the presence of uncertainty in both forensic and testimonial evidence, while the prosecution maintained that the overall body of evidence supported a coherent narrative of responsibility. The outcome of the trial resulted in convictions for the 3 defendants. This decision represented the legal conclusion of the case at that time, bringing a formal resolution to years of investigation and courtroom argument. However, the verdict did not eliminate controversy surrounding the case. Instead, it became the center of ongoing debate about the integrity of the investigative process and the reliability of the evidence used to support the convictions. In the years following the trial, questions continued to be raised about whether the conclusions reached in court accurately reflected the underlying facts of the case. One of the key sources of continued controversy was the role of DNA evidence and its interpretation. As forensic science advanced in the years after the original trial, new methods of analysis became available, allowing previously examined evidence to be reevaluated. This reexamination did not simply reinforce earlier conclusions. In some instances, it introduced new uncertainty. The evolving nature of forensic technology meant that evidence once considered supportive of conviction could be viewed differently under updated scientific standards. This dynamic contributed to the ongoing legal and public debate surrounding the case. The convictions also raised broader questions about the investigative process itself. In complex criminal cases, particularly those involving multiple forms of trauma and limited early forensic capability, the accuracy of conclusions depends heavily on the quality of interpretation. If early investigative assumptions are flawed or incomplete, those errors can influence later stages of the legal process. In the Dana Ireland case, critics argued that such foundational issues may have played a role in shaping the outcome of the trial, while supporters of the convictions maintained that the totality of evidence supported the verdict. Over time, the case became more than a single criminal proceeding. It evolved into a broader example of the challenges faced by the justice system when dealing with evolving forensic science and long-term investigations. The intersection between early investigative limitations and later technological advancements created a situation in which the same evidence could be viewed in different ways depending on the tools available for analysis. This raised important questions about finality in legal judgments and the possibility of revisiting cases in light of new scientific understanding. Despite the legal resolution achieved through the convictions, the case did not reach a point of universal agreement. Instead, it remained a subject of legal scrutiny and public discussion. The presence of disputed evidence, combined with later developments in forensic analysis, ensured that the case continued to be examined even after the courtroom proceedings had concluded. In this sense, the trial did not represent the end of the case, but rather one stage in a longer and more complex legal history. The significance of the trial phase lies not only in its outcome but also in what it revealed about the limitations of the justice process in cases involving complex forensic evidence. It demonstrated how legal conclusions are shaped by the tools available at a given time and how those conclusions may be challenged as those tools evolve. It also highlighted the tension between the need for resolution in criminal cases and the possibility that future developments may alter the understanding of those resolutions. In the Dana Ireland case, the convictions of Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline Jr. represented a formal conclusion to the prosecution's narrative at that time. However, the continuing debates surrounding evidence interpretation, forensic reliability, and investigative methodology ensured that the case remained open in a broader sense. The legal system had reached a decision, but the questions raised by the case continued to exist beyond that decision, shaping how the case would be viewed in later years and contributing to its lasting significance in discussions of criminal justice and forensic science. In the years following the convictions in the Dana Ireland case, the sense of finality that often accompanies a courtroom verdict did not fully take hold. Instead, the case entered a prolonged period of reassessment, shaped by developments in forensic science, evolving legal standards, and continued scrutiny of the original investigation. What had once been considered a concluded matter gradually transformed into an example of how time, technology, and persistent questioning can reshape the understanding of a criminal case. The story did not end with the verdict. In many ways, it began again under a different set of conditions. One of the most significant factors in this renewed phase of the case was the advancement of DNA analysis. In the early 1990s, when the investigation first began, DNA technology was limited in both precision and availability. As the years progressed into the 2000s, these limitations began to diminish. New methods allowed for more detailed examination of biological evidence, and materials that had once produced inconclusive or uncertain results could now be analyzed with greater clarity. In the Dana Ireland case, this technological shift opened the door to re-examining evidence that had already played a role in the original investigation and trial. The reanalysis of DNA evidence introduced new questions rather than simple confirmation of earlier conclusions. In some instances, the updated scientific findings did not align clearly with the narrative that had been established during the trial. This discrepancy became a focal point for legal review, as it raised the possibility that the original interpretation of evidence might not have been accurate. When forensic evidence changes in meaning over time, it challenges not only the conclusions drawn from that evidence, but also the processes through which those conclusions were reached. As a result, the case began to be discussed within the broader context of potential wrongful conviction. This designation does not rest on a single piece of evidence, but on the cumulative effect of uncertainty, inconsistency, and evolving interpretation. In the Dana Ireland case, the combination of early investigative limitations, disputed evidence, and later scientific developments created conditions under which the original verdicts could be questioned. This questioning did not occur in isolation. It became part of a wider legal and public conversation about how justice systems respond when new information emerges long after a case has been decided. The legal system, by design, values finality. Once a verdict is reached, there is a strong institutional emphasis on maintaining that conclusion unless compelling evidence justifies reopening the case. In situations where new DNA analysis introduces doubt, courts must balance the principle of finality against the need for accuracy. In the Dana Ireland case, this balance became a central issue. Legal proceedings extended beyond the initial trial, involving appeals, reviews, and reconsiderations that stretched over many years. Each stage of this process required a reassessment of earlier findings in light of new evidence or new interpretations of existing evidence. For those involved in the case, this extended timeline had significant consequences. Legal uncertainty can persist for decades, affecting not only the individuals directly connected to the case, but also the broader perception of justice within the community. When a case remains unresolved in the sense that its conclusions are continually questioned, it occupies a unique position in the legal landscape. It is neither fully closed nor fully open, existing instead in a state of ongoing evaluation. Beyond the legal implications, the Dana Ireland case also came to represent a broader lesson about the limitations of investigative processes in earlier periods. In the early 1990s, investigators worked with the tools available to them, which did not include the full capabilities of modern forensic science. This limitation does not imply negligence by itself, but it does highlight the challenges of making definitive conclusions under conditions of uncertainty. When those early conclusions are later revisited with improved technology, the differences between past and present capabilities become evident. The case also illustrates the importance of how evidence is interpreted and presented. Even when physical evidence exists, its meaning is not always self-evident. It must be analyzed, contextualized, and explained within a framework that connects it to the broader narrative of the case. If that framework is flawed or incomplete, the interpretation of evidence can lead to conclusions that are later challenged. In this sense, the Dana Ireland case is not only about the events of December 24, 1991, but also about the processes through which those events were understood and acted upon. As discussions about the case continued, it became the reference point in legal and academic settings. It was cited as an example of the need for caution in relying on incomplete forensic evidence and as a demonstration of how advancements in science can alter the course of justice. In criminal law education, cases like this are often used to illustrate the dynamic relationship between evidence, technology, and legal decision-making. They show that the pursuit of justice is not always linear and that conclusions reached at one point in time may be revisited as new tools become available. At the center of all these developments remains the original event, the death of a 23-year-old woman who was cycling on a rural road on Christmas Eve. While the legal and forensic complexities of the case have grown over time, the underlying human reality has not changed. Dana Ireland's life ended as a result of a sequence of violence that began with a collision and escalated into assault and fatal injury. This fact anchors the case, providing a point of certainty in an otherwise evolving narrative. The passage of time has also influenced how the case is remembered. For some, It is a story about investigative difficulty and the challenges of solving complex crimes in rural environments. For others, it is a cautionary example of how errors in interpretation can lead to long-term consequences within the justice system. For still others, it is a case that remains unresolved in a deeper sense, because the questions raised by new evidence have not been fully answered. These different perspectives coexist, reflecting the multifaceted nature of the case. In reflecting on the Dana Ireland case, it becomes clear that its significance extends beyond the specific details of the crime. It raises broader questions about how justice is pursued, how evidence is evaluated, and how certainty is established in situations where information is incomplete or evolving. It also highlights the importance of maintaining a willingness to revisit conclusions when new evidence emerges, even when doing so challenges earlier decisions. The legacy of the case is therefore not defined solely by its outcome, but by its ongoing influence on discussions of forensic science and legal process. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth in criminal cases is an ongoing process, one that can extend far beyond the initial investigation and trial. It demonstrates that justice is not only about reaching a conclusion, but about ensuring that the conclusion remains consistent with the best available understanding of the facts. At its core, the story of Dana Ireland is one of interruption. A routine activity was interrupted by a violent event. An investigation was interrupted by uncertainty. A legal conclusion was interrupted by new evidence. Each stage of the case reflects a moment where expectations were disrupted and where new questions emerged. These interruptions are what give the case its enduring complexity and its lasting impact. In the end, the case does not offer a simple resolution. Instead, it presents a layered narrative in which certainty and uncertainty exist side by side. It shows how the passage of time can both clarify and complicate, how advancements in knowledge can reopen what once seemed closed, and how the search for truth can continue long after a verdict has been delivered. And through all of this, it returns to the same point of origin, a quiet road on the Big Island, a young woman on a bicycle, and a night that changed everything. In the years since the Dana Ireland case first entered public awareness, it has continued to exist not only as a legal matter, but as a narrative that resists closure. Even after the formal structures of investigation, trial, and appeal have run their course, certain cases remain active in a different sense. They persist in discussion in legal analysis and in the broader cultural memory of how justice is pursued and understood. The story of Dana Ireland has become one of those cases, not because every question has been answered, but because some of them have not. When a case extends across decades, its meaning begins to shift. It is no longer defined solely by the original crime, but also by the layers of interpretation that accumulate over time. Each stage of the Dana Ireland case introduced new elements into the narrative. The initial investigation brought uncertainty and fragmentation. The trial brought structure and resolution, at least in a formal sense. The later re-examination of evidence brought renewed doubt and reconsideration. Together, these stages form a sequence that is as complex as the events that took place on that December night in 1991. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is the way it illustrates the limitations of certainty. In many criminal cases, there is an expectation that the legal process will produce a clear and final answer. A verdict is delivered, responsibility is assigned, and the case is considered resolved. But in situations where evidence is incomplete, where forensic methods evolve, and where interpretations are later challenged, that expectation becomes harder to sustain. The Dana Ireland case demonstrates that resolution in a legal sense does not always equate to resolution in a broader sense. This distinction is important because it highlights the difference between procedural closure and factual clarity. Procedural closure occurs when the legal system completes its process, when a case moves through investigation, trial, and appeal. Factual clarity, on the other hand, depends on the degree to which the underlying events are fully and accurately understood. In some cases, these two forms of closure align. In others, including this one, they may diverge. The legal system may reach a conclusion, while questions about the underlying facts continue to exist. The role of forensic science in this divergence cannot be overstated. In the early 1990s, the tools available to investigators were limited in ways that are now more clearly understood. DNA analysis, in particular, has undergone significant transformation since that time. As methods improved, the ability to extract and interpret biological evidence increased, allowing for more precise conclusions. However, this progress also introduced a new dynamic. Evidence that had once been considered sufficient could later be reevaluated under more advanced standards. This reevaluation does not simply add clarity, it can also introduce contradiction. In the Dana Ireland case, the re-examination of evidence became a turning point in how the case was perceived. It shifted the focus from what had been concluded to what might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. This shift reflects a broader trend in criminal justice, where advances in science create opportunities to revisit past cases. These opportunities are essential for correcting potential errors, but they also complicate the idea of finality. If new evidence can emerge at any time, then no conclusion is entirely immune to reconsideration. The human dimension of the case remains central throughout these developments. At the core of every legal and forensic discussion is the reality that a life was lost. Dana Ireland was a young woman engaged in a routine activity, and her life ended through a sequence of violence that was both sudden and severe. This fact does not change, regardless of how the case is interpreted or reinterpreted over time. It provides a constant point of reference in a narrative that otherwise continues to evolve. At the same time, the individuals who are charged and convicted also become part of the case's human dimension. When questions arise about the accuracy of a conviction, the implications extend beyond abstract legal principles. They affect real lives, shaping years and sometimes decades of personal experience. This aspect of the case underscores the importance of accuracy in the justice system. The consequences of error are not theoretical. They are lived realities that persist long after the courtroom proceedings have ended. The broader community is also affected by cases like this. When a case remains unresolved in a deeper sense, it can influence public perception of the justice system. Confidence in legal institutions depends in part on the belief that outcomes are both fair and accurate. When doubt emerges, that confidence can be challenged. At the same time, the willingness to revisit and re-examine cases can also be seen as a strength, demonstrating a commitment to correcting potential mistakes. The balance between these perspectives is part of what makes cases like Dana Ireland's so significant. Another important dimension of the case is its role as a learning tool. In legal education and forensic training, cases that involve complexity and controversy are often studied in detail. They provide examples of how investigations can be affected by environmental conditions, technological limitations, and human judgment. They also highlight the importance of maintaining rigorous standards in evidence collection and analysis. The Dana Ireland case, with its combination of factors, offers a comprehensive example of these challenges. Over time, the narrative of the case has expanded beyond its original boundaries. It is no longer only about what happened on a specific road on a specific night. It is also about how that event was investigated, how conclusions were reached, and how those conclusions were later questioned. Each of these layers adds to the overall understanding of the case, creating a narrative that is both detailed and unresolved. This complexity is what gives the case its lasting relevance. In reflecting on the case as a whole, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in its details, but in its structure. It follows a pattern that is increasingly recognized in modern criminal justice: an initial event, an investigation shaped by available tools, a legal resolution, and a later phase of reevaluation driven by new technology. This pattern is not unique to this case, but the clarity with which it is expressed here makes it particularly instructive. The passage of time continues to influence how the case is understood. With each passing year, the distance from the original event increases, but the relevance of the questions it raises does not diminish. If anything, that relevance grows as similar issues arise in other cases. The Dana Ireland case becomes part of a larger conversation about how justice systems adapt to change, how they incorporate new knowledge, and how they address the possibility of past error. At its conclusion, or rather at its current point in an ongoing narrative, the case does not offer a definitive answer to every question it raises. Instead, it presents a series of interconnected themes: the unpredictability of violence, the challenges of investigation, the limitations of early forensic science, and the evolving nature of legal understanding. These themes extend beyond the specifics of a case, touching on broader issues that are central to the functioning of the justice system. What remains, after all the analysis and reconsideration, is a sense of complexity that resists simplification. The case cannot be reduced to a single narrative without losing important aspects of its meaning. It is both a story of a crime and a story of how that crime was understood. It is both a record of what happened and a record of how knowledge about what happened has changed over time. In that sense, the Dana Ireland case continues to exist not only in legal documents or investigative files, but in the ongoing effort to understand it. Each new perspective, each re-examination of evidence, and each discussion about its implications adds another layer to that understanding. The search for clarity continues, shaped by the recognition that some questions may never be fully resolved, but that the effort to ask them remains essential. As the narrative of the Dana Ireland case extends beyond the immediate boundaries of crime, investigation, and legal resolution, it begins to settle into a different kind of space, one that is less defined by specific events and more by the lingering questions those events leave behind. Over time, certain cases move beyond their original context and become part of a broader reflection on how truth is pursued, how justice is constructed, and how certainty is negotiated in situations where the available information is incomplete or evolving. This case has come to occupy that space, not because it offers clear answers, but because it demonstrates how difficult those answers can be to secure. At the center of this enduring complexity is the tension between what is known and what remains uncertain. The foundational facts of the case, the collision, the relocation, the assault, and the death, form a structure that is not in dispute. These elements establish that a violent crime occurred and that it unfolded through a sequence of actions rather than a single isolated moment. Yet beyond this structure, the case becomes less defined. The details that would provide full clarity, particularly those related to responsibility and interpretation of evidence, remain subject to examination and debate. This tension is what gives the case its lasting significance, as it highlights the gap that can exist between establishing that a crime occurred and fully understanding how and why it occurred. The passage of time plays a critical role in shaping this gap. As years turn into decades, the nature of evidence changes. Physical materials may degrade, documentation may become more difficult to contextualize, and the individuals involved in the case may no longer be able to provide new information. At the same time, advancements in technology introduce new methods of analysis that can shed light on previously uncertain aspects of the case. This combination of loss and discovery creates a dynamic environment in which the case is never entirely static. It evolves, not because the original events change, but because the tools used to understand those events continue to develop. In this evolving context, the Dana Ireland case serves as a point of reference for discussions about the reliability of evidence. It illustrates how conclusions are often shaped by the tools and knowledge available at a given moment. When those tools improve, earlier conclusions may be reinforced, but they may also be challenged. This possibility of challenge is essential to the integrity of the justice system, as it allows for correction and refinement. However, it also introduces a degree of instability, as it means that no conclusion is entirely beyond reconsideration. The case demonstrates that certainty in criminal justice is often provisional, dependent on the best available evidence rather than absolute knowledge. Another important dimension of the case is its impact on how investigations are conducted. The difficulties encountered in the early stages of this case, particularly those related to scene disturbance and limited forensic capability, highlight the importance of meticulous evidence handling and documentation. In modern investigative practice, there is a heightened awareness of these issues, informed in part by cases where early errors or limitations had long-term consequences. The Dana Ireland case contributes to this awareness by providing a concrete example of how initial conditions can influence the entire trajectory of an investigation. The legal implications of the case also extend beyond its immediate outcome. It raises questions about how courts should respond when new evidence emerges after a conviction has been secured. The balance between finality and accuracy becomes a central concern. On one hand, the legal system requires closure to function effectively. On the other hand, it must remain open to the possibility that new information can alter the understanding of a case. This balance is not easily achieved, and the Dana Ireland case illustrates the complexity involved in maintaining it. It shows that the pursuit of justice does not end with a verdict, but continues as long as questions remain. At a human level, the case continues to resonate because it reflects the unpredictability of violence and the fragility of routine. Dana Ireland's final actions were ordinary, part of a pattern of life that did not suggest danger. The abrupt transition from that routine to a sequence of violence underscores how quickly circumstances can change and how little warning such changes may provide. This aspect of the case contributes to its emotional weight, reminding observers that the boundary between normalcy and tragedy can be unexpectedly thin. The case also invites reflection on the role of accountability in situations where certainty is incomplete. In criminal justice, accountability is typically established through evidence that links individuals to specific actions. When that evidence is questioned, the process of assigning responsibility becomes more complex. The Dana Ireland case illustrates this complexity by showing how the interpretation of evidence can influence conclusions about responsibility and how those conclusions may later be revisited. It highlights the importance of maintaining rigorous standards of proof, particularly in cases where the consequences of error are profound. In broader terms, the case contributes to an ongoing conversation about the nature of truth in legal contexts. Truth, in this sense, is not simply a collection of facts, but a structured understanding of events that is constructed through investigation, analysis, and interpretation. When any of these elements is uncertain or incomplete, the resulting understanding may also be incomplete. The Dana Ireland case demonstrates that truth in criminal justice is often a process rather than a fixed outcome, one that can evolve as new information becomes available. As the case continues to be examined and discussed, it also serves as a reminder of the importance of persistence in the search for clarity. Even when answers are difficult to obtain, the effort to seek them remains significant. This persistence is reflected in the continued analysis of evidence, the willingness to revisit earlier conclusions, and the broader commitment to understanding what happened. While the case may never reach a point of complete resolution, the process of engaging with its complexities contributes to the ongoing development of investigative and legal practices. In the end, the Dana Ireland case does not provide a simple narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Instead, it presents a layered story in which each stage adds new dimensions to the overall understanding. It begins with a routine action, moves through a sequence of violence, expands into a complex investigation, and continues into a prolonged period of legal and forensic reevaluation. Each of these stages is connected, yet each also introduces new elements that complicate the narrative. What remains constant throughout this progression is the presence of unanswered questions. These questions are not a sign of failure, but a reflection of the inherent difficulty of reconstructing events under conditions of uncertainty. They remind us that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing process, one that requires both confidence in established methods and openness to new possibilities. The Dana Ireland case embodies this dual requirement, illustrating how certainty and uncertainty coexist within the same framework. As time continues to pass, the case will likely remain part of discussions about forensic science, legal process, and the challenges of achieving accurate outcomes in complex situations. Its significance lies not only in what it reveals about a specific event, but in what it teaches about the broader systems used to understand such events. It stands as an example of how those systems can both succeed and struggle, and how they must continue to adapt in response to new knowledge. Ultimately, the case returns to the same essential point from which it began. A young woman set out on a bicycle ride on a quiet road, and that ordinary act was interrupted by violence. Everything that followed, the investigation, the trial, the controversy, and the ongoing reflection, stems from that moment. The details may continue to be examined and debated, but the central reality remains unchanged. It is this combination of certainty and uncertainty, of known facts and unresolved questions, that defines the enduring legacy of the Dana Ireland case. By the time the Dana Ireland case reaches what might be considered its final narrative layer, it no longer exists solely as a sequence of events tied to a single night in 1991. Instead, it has become a framework through which broader ideas about justice, evidence, and uncertainty are examined. What began as a tragic and violent incident on a rural road has extended into a long and evolving dialogue, one that continues to challenge assumptions about how truth is identified and how conclusions are formed within the legal system. This final phase is not defined by new facts alone, but by the accumulation of interpretation, reflection, and the persistent effort to reconcile what is known with what remains unresolved. At its core, the case presents a contrast between simplicity and complexity. The initial facts are direct and unambiguous in their outline. A young woman was cycling alone. She was struck by a vehicle. She was moved, assaulted, and ultimately killed. These elements establish a clear and undeniable sequence of harm. Yet surrounding this core is a web of complexity that has expanded over time. Each attempt to explain, investigate, and resolve the case has introduced additional layers, turning what might have been a straightforward narrative into one that resists complete understanding. This contrast is what gives the case its enduring power and its continued relevance. One of the most important aspects of this final phase is the recognition that not all cases reach a point of definitive closure. In the legal system, closure is often associated with verdicts and final judgments. However, the Dana Ireland case demonstrates that closure in a procedural sense does not always align with closure in a conceptual or emotional sense. Questions about evidence, interpretation, and responsibility can persist even after the formal processes have concluded. This persistence does not diminish the importance of the legal system, but it does highlight its limitations when dealing with complex and evolving information. The role of time in shaping this outcome cannot be overstated. Over decades, the context in which the case is understood has changed significantly. Advances in forensic science have altered the standards by which evidence is evaluated. Legal frameworks have adapted to incorporate new types of analysis. Public awareness of wrongful convictions and investigative errors has increased, creating a more critical environment in which past cases are reviewed. These changes do not alter the original events, but they do influence how those events are interpreted. The Dana Ireland case exists at the intersection of these shifting perspectives, making it a point of reference for how understanding evolves over time. Another key element of this phase is the relationship between certainty and doubt. In many areas of life, certainty is treated as an endpoint, a state in which questions have been answered and ambiguity has been resolved. In criminal justice, however, certainty is often provisional, based on the best available evidence rather than absolute knowledge. The Dana Ireland case illustrates this reality by showing how conclusions can be challenged as new information emerges. Doubt, in this context, is not merely a problem to be eliminated, but a signal that further examination may be necessary. It plays a crucial role in ensuring that the pursuit of truth remains active rather than static. The case also invites consideration of how narratives are constructed and maintained. Every stage of the investigation and trial involved the creation of a narrative that connected evidence to conclusions. These narratives are essential for making sense of complex information, but they are also influenced by the perspectives and limitations of those constructing them. When new evidence or new methods of analysis become available, these narratives may need to be revised. The Dana Ireland case demonstrates how this process of revision can unfold over time, with each new layer of analysis adding depth but also introducing new questions. In examining the broader implications of the case, it becomes clear that it serves as a reminder of the importance of humility in the face of complexity. The desire for clear answers is understandable, particularly in cases involving serious harm. However, the reality is that not all questions can be answered with complete certainty. Recognizing this limitation does not weaken the pursuit of justice. Rather, it strengthens it by encouraging ongoing inquiry and openness to new information. The Dana Ireland case embodies this principle, showing that the search for understanding is often an ongoing process rather than a final destination. The human impact of the case remains central even in this final phase. At the heart of every discussion about evidence and procedure is the fact that a life was lost. Dana Ireland's story is not defined solely by the circumstances of her death, but also by the way those circumstances have been examined and re-examined over time. This dual perspective, focusing both on the individual and on the broader system, is essential for understanding the full significance of the case. It ensures that the discussion does not become purely abstract, but remains grounded in the reality of human experience. The case also highlights the interconnectedness of different elements within the justice system. Investigation, forensic analysis, legal argument, and judicial decision-making are all part of a single process, each influencing the others. When one element is uncertain or incomplete, that uncertainty can propagate through the entire system. The Dana Ireland case demonstrates how these interactions can shape the outcome of a case and how they can be revisited when new information becomes available. It underscores the importance of maintaining strong standards at every stage, as the effects of early decisions can extend far into the future. As the narrative reaches this point, it becomes less about resolving specific details and more about understanding the broader lessons that the case offers. These lessons include the need for careful evidence handling, the importance of adapting to new scientific developments, and the value of maintaining a willingness to question established conclusions. They also include the recognition that justice is not a static concept, but one that evolves as knowledge and technology advance. The Dana Ireland case serves as a powerful example of these principles in action. Looking forward, the case is likely to remain part of ongoing discussions about criminal justice and forensic science. Its complexity ensures that it will continue to be studied and referenced, not only for its specific details, but for the broader questions it raises. Each new generation of investigators, legal professionals, and scholars may approach the case with different tools and perspectives, adding further layers to its interpretation. In this way, the case continues to live on, not only as a historical event, but as an active part of the conversation about how justice is pursued. In conclusion, the Dana Ireland case stands as a multifaceted narrative that defies simple categorization. It is at once a story of violence, a study in investigative complexity, a legal controversy, and a reflection on the evolving nature of truth. Its significance lies not in providing definitive answers, but in illustrating the challenges involved in seeking them. Through its progression from incident to investigation, from trial to reevaluation, and from resolution to ongoing reflection, it offers a comprehensive view of how the justice system operates under conditions of uncertainty. What remains at the end is not a sense of finality, but a recognition of continuity. The case continues to be examined, questioned, and understood in new ways. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is an enduring process, one that requires both commitment and adaptability. And within that process, the story of Dana Ireland remains a central point of reference, a case that continues to shape how we think about evidence, responsibility, and the possibility of truly understanding what happened on that quiet road so many years ago. As the Dana Ireland case reaches what can be considered its final reflective stage, it stands not as a closed chapter but as an enduring examination of how justice operates over time, particularly in situations shaped by uncertainty, evolving science, and the weight of irreversible consequences. What began on a quiet road on December 24, 1991, did not end with the immediate aftermath of violence, nor with the investigation that followed, nor even with the courtroom decisions that attempted to define responsibility. Instead, the case has continued to unfold through years of reassessment, reflection, and ongoing dialogue about what it means to seek truth in a system that must often act before complete certainty is possible. At the center of this enduring narrative is a fundamental tension between resolution and doubt. The justice system is structured to provide answers. It is designed to gather evidence, establish facts, and reach conclusions that can be enforced and accepted within a legal framework. Yet the Dana Ireland case demonstrates that the process of reaching those conclusions does not always eliminate uncertainty. Instead, it can coexist with it, creating a situation in which a legal answer exists alongside lingering questions about its completeness or accuracy. This coexistence is not unique to this case, but it is particularly visible here because of the role that changing forensic technology has played in shaping its trajectory. The evolution of DNA analysis is one of the defining factors in how the case has been understood over time. In the early 1990s, when the investigation began, the available tools for analyzing biological evidence were limited in both scope and precision. Investigators worked within those limitations, constructing a narrative based on the best information they could obtain. As the years passed and DNA technology advanced, those same pieces of evidence could be examined in new ways, revealing details that were previously inaccessible. This shift illustrates a broader reality within criminal justice, that conclusions are often tied to the capabilities of the moment in which they are made. When those capabilities change, the conclusions may need to be reconsidered. This dynamic introduces a question that extends beyond the specifics of any single case. How should the justice system respond when new methods of analysis challenge earlier findings? The answer is not simple because it involves balancing competing principles. On one hand, there is a need for finality, for decisions that can be relied upon and that provide closure. On the other hand, there is a need for accuracy, for conclusions that reflect the best possible understanding of the facts. The Dana Ireland case exists at the intersection of these principles, illustrating how difficult it can be to maintain both at the same time. The case also highlights the importance of process in determining outcome. Every stage of the investigation, from the initial response to the discovery of the body, to the collection and interpretation of evidence, contributed to the narrative that was eventually presented in court. When that process is affected by limitations or errors, those effects can persist throughout the life of the case. This does not mean that the outcome is necessarily incorrect, but it does mean that the reliability of the outcome depends heavily on the integrity of each step in the process. The Dana Ireland case demonstrates how early uncertainties can carry forward, influencing later conclusions even as new information becomes available. In considering the broader implications of the case, it is also necessary to reflect on the role of perspective. Different individuals and groups may view the same set of facts in different ways, depending on their position within the system. Investigators, legal professionals, forensic experts, and members of the public each bring their own frameworks for understanding the case. These frameworks influence how evidence is interpreted, how conclusions are evaluated, and how doubt is perceived. The persistence of debate in the Dana Ireland case reflects the coexistence of these differing perspectives, each contributing to the ongoing dialogue about what the case represents. At the human level, the case continues to resonate because it is rooted in a loss that cannot be undone. Dana Ireland was 23 years old, engaged in a routine activity that was part of her daily life. The sudden and violent end of that routine transformed a personal tragedy into a matter of public and legal significance. While the case has grown to include complex discussions about evidence and procedure, it remains grounded in that original loss. This grounding is essential, as it ensures that the narrative does not become detached from the reality that gave rise to it. The individuals who were charged and convicted also remain part of this human dimension, particularly in light of the questions that have been raised about the evidence used against them. When a case involves the possibility of wrongful conviction, the implications extend beyond abstract legal concerns. They affect real lives, shaping years of experience and influencing how justice is perceived by those directly involved. The Dana Ireland case, in this respect, serves as a reminder of the weight carried by legal decisions and the importance of ensuring that those decisions are as accurate as possible. The case also contributes to a broader understanding of how the justice system adapts to change. Over time, new standards of evidence, new investigative techniques, and new legal precedents emerge, influencing how cases are handled. The Dana Ireland case reflects this process of adaptation, showing how earlier practices are reevaluated in light of new knowledge. This process is not always smooth or straightforward, but it is an essential part of maintaining a system that seeks to improve over time. By examining cases like this one, the justice system can identify areas where improvement is needed and work toward more reliable methods of investigation and analysis. As the narrative reaches its final stage, it becomes clear that the Dana Ireland case does not offer a definitive conclusion in the traditional sense. Instead, it offers a set of lessons about the nature of justice, the limitations of evidence, and the importance of remaining open to new information. These lessons extend beyond the specifics of the case, providing insight into how similar situations might be approached in the future. They emphasize the need for careful evidence handling, the value of scientific advancement, and the importance of maintaining a balance between certainty and doubt. The enduring relevance of the case lies in its ability to illustrate these principles in a concrete and compelling way. It shows how a single event can generate a complex and evolving narrative, one that continues to influence how justice is understood long after the initial incident has passed. It also demonstrates that the pursuit of truth is not a static endeavor, but one that requires ongoing effort, reflection, and adaptation. In this sense, the case serves as both a historical record and a living example of how the justice system engages with uncertainty. Ultimately, the story returns to its point of origin, not as a resolution, but as a reminder. A young woman set out on a bicycle ride on a quiet evening, and that ordinary act was interrupted by a sequence of violence that changed everything. From that moment, a chain of events unfolded, leading to investigation, trial, controversy, and continued reflection. Each stage added new dimensions to the case, shaping how it is understood and remembered. Yet despite all of these developments, the central reality remains unchanged. The Dana Ireland case stands as a testament to the complexity of seeking truth in a world where information is incomplete and where understanding evolves over time. It does not provide easy answers, but it does offer a deeper appreciation of the challenges involved in finding them. It reminds us that justice is not simply about reaching a conclusion, but about ensuring that the path to that conclusion is as thorough, careful, and open to revision as possible. And in that ongoing effort, the case continues to hold significance, not only for what it reveals about the past, but for what it suggests about the future of justice itself. As the narrative of the Dana Ireland case extends even further beyond its original boundaries, it reaches a stage where reflection becomes less about the sequence of events and more about the enduring implications those events have left behind. What began as a tragic and violent incident on a rural road in 1991 has evolved into a case that continues to shape conversations about justice, evidence, and the limits of certainty. This final layer is not defined by new discoveries alone, but by the accumulation of meaning over time, as each stage of the case contributes to a broader understanding of how truth is pursued and how it can remain elusive even after years of investigation and legal process. One of the most striking aspects of this case is the way it illustrates the persistence of uncertainty. In many narratives, uncertainty is treated as a temporary condition, something that exists only until sufficient information is gathered to resolve it. In the Dana Ireland case, however, uncertainty has proven to be more enduring. Even as evidence has been collected, analyzed, and reanalyzed, and even as legal decisions have been made, questions have continued to emerge. This persistence does not suggest a failure of the system, but rather highlights the complexity of the circumstances under which the case was investigated. It demonstrates that some cases resist complete resolution, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the inherent limitations of available information and the conditions under which that information was obtained. The evolution of forensic science plays a central role in this dynamic. When the case was first investigated, the tools available for analyzing evidence were limited in ways that are now more clearly understood. Over time, advancements in DNA technology and other forensic methods have expanded the ability to interpret physical evidence. These advancements have not only provided new insights, but have also prompted a re-examination of earlier conclusions. This process of reevaluation is essential for maintaining the integrity of the justice system, as it allows for the possibility that previous interpretations may need to be adjusted in light of new information. At the same time, it introduces a level of complexity that can make it difficult to determine when a case has truly reached a point of resolution. The Dana Ireland case also underscores the importance of critical examination at every stage of the investigative and legal process. From the initial response to the crime scene to the collection and analysis of evidence, to the presentation of that evidence in court, each step plays a role in shaping the final outcome. When any part of this process is affected by uncertainty or a limitation, the effects can extend throughout the entire case. This interconnectedness highlights the need for rigorous standards and careful attention to detail, particularly in cases where the consequences of error are so significant. At the same time, the case reveals the challenges of balancing competing priorities within the justice system. On one hand, there is a need to reach conclusions, to provide answers that can bring a sense of closure and allow the system to move forward. On the other hand, there is a need to ensure that those conclusions are as accurate as possible, even if achieving that accuracy requires revisiting earlier decisions. The tension between these priorities is evident throughout the Dana Ireland case, as the pursuit of finality is continually influenced by the possibility of new information. Another important dimension of the case is its impact on how similar cases are approached in the future. By examining the challenges and controversies associated with this case, investigators and legal professionals can gain valuable insights into how to improve their practices. This includes recognizing the importance of preserving crime scenes, the need for reliable and consistent evidence collection, and the value of incorporating new scientific methods as they become available. The lessons learned from this case contribute to a broader effort to enhance the effectiveness and reliability of the justice system. The case also invites reflection on the role of narrative in shaping understanding. Throughout the investigation and trial, different narratives were constructed to explain the evidence and establish responsibility. These narratives are necessary for organizing complex information, but they are also influenced by the perspectives and assumptions of those who create them. When new evidence emerges or when existing evidence is reinterpreted, these narratives may need to be revised. The Dana Ireland case illustrates how this process can unfold over time, with each new layer of analysis adding depth but also introducing new complexities. At its core, the case remains grounded in the loss of a young life. Dana Ireland was 23 years old, engaged in an activity that was part of her routine when her life was abruptly ended. This fact provides a constant point of reference throughout the evolving narrative, reminding us that the case is not only about evidence and procedure, but also about the human impact of violence. The continued examination of the case reflects a broader commitment to understanding what happened and to ensuring that such events are addressed with the seriousness they deserve. The individuals who were charged and convicted in connection with the case also remain part of its ongoing story, particularly in light of the questions that have been raised about the evidence used to support those convictions. When a case involves the possibility of error, the implications extend beyond the immediate circumstances, affecting broader perceptions of fairness and reliability within the justice system. The Dana Ireland case highlights the importance of maintaining a system that is capable of both reaching conclusions and revisiting them when necessary. As the narrative continues to evolve, the case serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing process. It is not confined to a single moment or a single decision, but extends across time as new information becomes available and as understanding deepens. This ongoing nature is both a challenge and a strength, as it allows for the possibility of correction while also requiring a continuous commitment to inquiry and reflection. In considering the broader significance of the case, it becomes clear that its impact extends beyond its specific details. It contributes to a larger conversation about how justice systems operate, how they respond to uncertainty, and how they adapt to new knowledge. The Dana Ireland case provides a concrete example of these dynamics, illustrating both the potential and the limitations of the processes used to investigate and resolve complex crimes. Ultimately, the case does not offer a simple or definitive conclusion. Instead, it presents a layered narrative in which certainty and uncertainty coexist, and in which the search for truth continues even after formal processes have concluded. This complexity is not a weakness, but a reflection of the reality that understanding is often incomplete and subject to change. The Dana Ireland case stands as a testament to this reality, demonstrating that the pursuit of justice is not a static endeavor, but one that evolves over time. As the story reaches this stage, It leaves us with a deeper appreciation of the challenges involved in seeking truth and the importance of remaining open to new perspectives. It reminds us that while answers may be difficult to obtain, the effort to seek them is essential. And in that effort, the case of Dana, Ireland continues to hold meaning, not only as a record of a tragic event, but as an enduring example of how justice is pursued in the face of complexity and uncertainty. As the story of the Dana, Ireland case reaches its final extension, it settles into a space that is less about discovering new facts and more about understanding the weight of what has already unfolded. Over time, the case has moved far beyond its origin as a single criminal investigation. It has become a reflection of how justice is pursued under imperfect conditions, how truth is assembled from fragments, and how certainty can remain just out of reach even after years of effort. In this final stage, what matters most is not only what is known, but how that knowledge has been constructed, challenged, and carried forward. The case continues to stand as a convergence point between different forces that shape the justice system. There is the force of evidence, which provides the material basis for understanding what occurred. There is the force of interpretation, which translates that evidence into a narrative that can be examined and tested. There is the force of law, which applies standards and procedures to determine responsibility. And there is the force of time, which alters all of these elements by introducing new methods, new perspectives, and new questions. The Dana, Ireland case exists at the intersection of these forces, making it an enduring example of how complex their interaction can be. At the heart of the case is a sequence of events that remains constant. A young woman was riding her bicycle on a rural road. She was struck by a vehicle, moved from that location, subjected to violence, and ultimately died as a result of her injuries. These facts provide a fixed point around which all other aspects of the case revolve. They do not change, regardless of how the evidence is interpreted or reinterpreted. What changes is the understanding of how those events are connected, who is responsible for them, and how confidently those conclusions can be held. The passage of time has added layers to this understanding, but it has also revealed the limits of what can be known. In the years immediately following the incident, investigators worked within the constraints of the tools available to them. Their conclusions were shaped by those constraints, as well as by the condition of the evidence and the environment in which the crime occurred. As new technologies emerged, particularly in the field of DNA analysis, the same evidence could be viewed in a different light. This process of reevaluation is essential for progress, but it also underscores the idea that knowledge is not static. It evolves, and with it, the interpretation of past events. The case also highlights the importance of acknowledging uncertainty. In many contexts, uncertainty is treated as something to be eliminated, a gap that must be filled in order to reach a conclusion. In the Dana, Ireland case, however, uncertainty remains an integral part of the narrative. It is present in the early stages of the investigation, in the interpretation of evidence, and in the later reevaluation of that evidence. Rather than disappearing over time, it becomes more clearly defined, shaping the way the case is understood and discussed. This presence of uncertainty does not weaken the case. Instead, it provides a more accurate reflection of the complexities involved. Another key aspect of this final stage is the recognition that justice is not a single event, but a process that unfolds over time. The initial investigation, the trial, and the subsequent legal reviews are all parts of this process. Each stage contributes to the overall understanding of the case, but none of them provides a complete picture on its own. The Dana, Ireland case demonstrates that justice is not simply about reaching a verdict, but about continually reassessing that verdict in light of new information and evolving standards. This ongoing process is essential for maintaining the integrity of the system, even when it introduces additional complexity. The human dimension of the case remains central throughout this progression. Dana, Ireland's life, her routine, and the circumstances of her death are the foundation upon which the entire narrative is built. While the case has expanded to include discussions of forensic science, legal procedure, and investigative practice, it is important to remember that these discussions are rooted in a real event with real consequences. The continued examination of the case reflects a broader commitment to understanding what happened and to ensuring that such events are addressed with the seriousness they deserve. At the same time, the case serves as a reminder of the broader impact that legal decisions can have. When questions arise about the accuracy of a conviction, the implications extend beyond the individuals directly involved. They affect public confidence in the justice system and influence how similar cases are approached in the future. The Dana Ireland case illustrates the importance of maintaining a system that is both decisive and adaptable, capable of reaching conclusions while also remaining open to reconsideration. In examining the lessons of the case, it becomes clear that one of its most significant contributions is its demonstration of how systems can learn and evolve. The challenges encountered in this case have informed changes in investigative practices, particularly in the areas of evidence preservation and forensic analysis. They have also contributed to a greater awareness of the need for ongoing review in cases where new information becomes available. These developments are part of a broader effort to improve the accuracy and reliability of the justice system, ensuring that it can respond effectively to both current and future challenges. The case also invites reflection on the nature of truth itself. In the context of criminal justice, truth is not always a single, clearly defined entity. It is constructed through a combination of evidence, interpretation, and judgment. When any of these elements is incomplete or uncertain, the resulting understanding may also be incomplete. The Dana Ireland case illustrates this reality by showing how different interpretations can coexist and how new information can reshape the narrative over time. It reminds us that truth, in this context, is not simply discovered, but continuously refined. As the narrative comes to its final stage, it leaves behind a legacy that is both complex and instructive. The case does not provide a simple answer or a definitive conclusion. Instead, it offers a detailed example of how difficult it can be to achieve certainty in the face of incomplete information and evolving knowledge. It shows that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing effort, one that requires persistence, adaptability, and a willingness to question established conclusions. In the end, the Dana Ireland case returns to the same essential point from which it began. A young woman set out on a bicycle ride on a quiet evening, and that routine was interrupted by a sequence of violence that changed everything. From that moment, a series of events unfolded, leading to investigation, trial, controversy, and continued reflection. Each stage added new dimensions to the case, shaping how it is understood and remembered. What remains is not a sense of closure, but a recognition of continuity. The case continues to be examined, discussed, and learned from, serving as a reminder of both the possibilities and the limitations of the justice system. It stands as a testament to the complexity of seeking truth and the importance of remaining open to new perspectives. And in that ongoing effort, the story of Dana Ireland continues to hold meaning, not only as a record of a tragic event, but as an enduring example of how justice is pursued in a world where certainty is never absolute. As the story of the Dana Ireland case continues into its final contemplative phase, it becomes less about reconstructing what happened and more about confronting what it means that some aspects of what happened may never be fully understood. There is a point in certain cases where the accumulation of evidence, analysis, and legal reasoning reaches a threshold beyond which clarity does not necessarily increase. Instead, the narrative stabilizes into a form defined by both knowledge and limitation. This is where the Dana Ireland case now resides, not as an unsolved mystery in the traditional sense, but as a case in which the boundaries of certainty have been reached and remain under continuous examination. What distinguishes this case is not only the nature of the crime itself, but the long trajectory through which it has been processed. The initial event, violent, abrupt, and devastating, created an immediate need for answers. That need drove the investigation forward, shaped the collection and interpretation of evidence, and ultimately led to legal conclusions. Yet as time passed, the introduction of new scientific methods and the re-examination of existing evidence altered the context in which those conclusions were understood. The result is a case that exists in two overlapping states, one defined by the decisions that have already been made, and another defined by the questions that those decisions continue to generate. This duality reflects a broader reality within the justice system. Decisions must be made within the constraints of the information available at the time, even when that information is incomplete. Investigators cannot wait indefinitely for perfect clarity, and courts must render judgments based on the evidence presented. However, when new information becomes available, it has the potential to reshape the understanding of past decisions. The Dana Ireland case exemplifies this dynamic, showing how the passage of time can transform not only the interpretation of evidence, but also the confidence placed in earlier conclusions. The concept of finality is central to this discussion. In legal terms, finality provides stability. It allows cases to be resolved, sentences to be carried out, and the system to function without constant reopening of past decisions. Yet finality is also conditional. It depends on the assumption that the conclusions reached are sufficiently accurate to withstand future scrutiny. When that assumption is challenged, the balance between stability and accuracy becomes more difficult to maintain. The Dana Ireland case highlights this tension, illustrating how the desire for closure can come into conflict with the need for continued inquiry. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of process over outcome. While the outcome of a case is significant, the integrity of the process that leads to that outcome is equally important. A just result depends not only on the correctness of the conclusion but also on the reliability of the methods used to reach it. In situations where the process is affected by limitations or uncertainty, the strength of the outcome may also be affected. The Dana Ireland case brings this issue into focus, emphasizing the need for careful, methodical approaches to evidence collection and analysis, particularly in cases involving complex and overlapping forms of trauma. The role of forensic science in shaping the trajectory of the case cannot be overlooked. As DNA analysis and other forensic techniques have advanced, they have provided new tools for examining evidence that was previously difficult to interpret. These advancements have the potential to clarify aspects of a case, but they can also introduce new ambiguities. In the Dana Ireland case, the re-examination of evidence using improved methods has contributed to ongoing discussions about the reliability of earlier interpretations. This process reflects a broader trend in criminal justice, where technological progress continually reshapes the landscape of what can be known and how it can be known. Beyond the technical aspects of the case, there is also a deeper philosophical dimension. The pursuit of justice is often framed as a search for truth, but the nature of truth in this context is complex. It is not simply a collection of facts, but a structured understanding of events that must be constructed from available evidence. When that evidence is incomplete or subject to reinterpretation, the resulting understanding may also be incomplete. The Dana Ireland case illustrates this reality, showing how truth can be approached but not fully captured, how it can be refined but not definitively fixed. The human impact of the case remains a constant presence throughout these reflections. At its center is the life of a young woman whose routine was interrupted by a sequence of violence that ended her life. This fact anchors the case in a reality that transcends legal and forensic analysis. It serves as a reminder that behind every discussion of evidence and procedure is a human story, one that involves loss, consequence, and the enduring effects of a single moment. The continued examination of the case reflects a broader commitment to acknowledging that reality and to seeking a deeper understanding of what occurred. The individuals who were implicated in the case also remain part of its ongoing narrative. When questions arise about the interpretation of evidence and the accuracy of conclusions, the implications extend beyond abstract considerations of justice. They affect real lives, shaping how the case is experienced and understood by those directly involved. This aspect of the case highlights the importance of maintaining a system that is capable of both making decisions and revisiting them when necessary, ensuring that the pursuit of justice remains responsive to new information. As the case continues to be studied and discussed, it contributes to a broader understanding of how complex cases can be approached. It provides insight into the challenges of working with incomplete evidence, the importance of adapting to new technologies, and the need for ongoing critical examination of established conclusions. These lessons are not limited to this case alone, but extend to the broader field of criminal justice, informing how future cases may be handled. In reflecting on the case as a whole, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in its details, but in its implications. It demonstrates that the pursuit of justice is not a straightforward path, but a process that involves uncertainty, adaptation, and continuous inquiry. It shows that conclusions, while necessary, are not always final in an absolute sense, and that the search for truth can continue even after those conclusions have been reached. The Dana Ireland case ultimately stands as a reminder of the limits of certainty and the importance of persistence. It does not provide a definitive answer to every question it raises, but it does offer a framework for understanding how such questions can be approached. It highlights the need for both confidence in established methods and openness to new possibilities, recognizing that the balance between these elements is essential for the functioning of the justice system. As the narrative reaches this stage, it does not close with a resolution but with an acknowledgement that some aspects of the case remain unresolved, that some questions continue to exist, and that the effort to understand what happened is ongoing. This acknowledgement is not a sign of failure, but a reflection of the complexity of the case and the reality that not all truths can be fully uncovered. In the end, the story returns once more to its origin, a quiet road, a routine activity, and a moment of violence that altered everything that followed. From that moment, a chain of events unfolded, leading to investigation, trial, controversy, and continued reflection. Each stage added depth to the narrative, shaping how it is understood and remembered. And as that narrative continues to evolve, it remains a powerful example of how the pursuit of justice can extend far beyond the boundaries of a single case, becoming an ongoing effort to understand, to question, and to seek clarity in a world where certainty is never absolute.